friend and colleague, Dr. Felita T. Williams, who serves as Associate Vice Chancellor for Strategic Academic Initiatives and Academic Affairs at the USG. My name is Archie Irvin, and I have the privilege of serving as the Vice President for Institute Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, Georgia. On behalf of my Chief Diversity Officer colleagues, I want to begin by offering our gratitude to all of you who have joined with us this year for our virtual conference that features one of our nation's leading public policy experts and noted social commentators, Ms. Heather Mcgee. For more than a decade, this annual event has been the premier professional development event for diversity and inclusion professionals in the USG, and has offered the same for our presidents, provosts, and senior USG leaders who are true supporters of our goal of ensuring that we educate all of our citizens of Georgia. Over the past 4 years, one of our ardent supporters of this annual event has been Dr. Tristan Denley, who is Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Academic Officer at the USG. He has attended our event for the past 4 years consecutively. Regrettably, he can't be with us today due to a family matter, so our thoughts are with him and his family. Before I ask my colleague to introduce our guest speaker for today, I want to inform all of our colleagues in the USG about another professional development opportunity that I encourage you to explore and to learn more about for possible engagement. Over the past 12 to 18 months, we have reinvigorated the Georgia Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. This is a subgroup of the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. Next Monday, we will offer an opportunity to gather at a virtual lunch and learn, where you can come and learn more about what GATAHE is doing. You can network with colleagues across the USG system and the state, and spend time developing your craft as diversity professionals. We hope that we can see you there, and we'll put some information in the chat about how to sign on to that event on next Monday, the 1st of November. And now, it is my great honor to introduce my colleague, Dr. Pablo Mendoza, who is Director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of North Georgia, and ask if he would introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Mendoza?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Ms. Heather Mcgee holds a bachelor's in American Studies from Yale University and a Juris Doctor in Law from the University of California, Berkeley. Her writing and research on debt, financial services, regulation, retirement, and inequality appears in numerous outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Detroit Free Press, and CNN. Her book, The Sum of Us, recommends a path forward for our country that is both multicultural and optimistic. Her Sum of Us TED Talk has been used in many college classrooms around the United States. Please welcome Ms. Mcgee.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really just honored to be with all of you. You are people who have dedicated your careers to education, and to not just any kind of education, but the most fair and just and equitable education, and making sure that all of our children have what they need to thrive and solve problems together. Because that's really what a diverse educational setting teaches students. It teaches them how to see the world through multiple perspectives, how to solve problems, how to unlock what I describe in my book as the solidarity dividends, these ideas of these gains that we can achieve, but only by coming together across lines of race. So I salute you, particularly after 2 years of very challenging circumstances for administrators and educators of all kinds across the country, and really do hope that you and yours are well. So I am going to talk for about 20 minutes or so about the journey that I took over the course of 3 years to write The Sum of Us, what compelled me to take that journey, what I learned, the insights that I was able to glean, and how I think they might be applicable to the issues that your communities are facing today. And then what I'm really excited for is a dialogue. We'll have a dialogue and then be able to have audience questions. So I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay, and before I launch in, that there aren't any other technical issues or anything. Okay. All right. Hearing none. Here I go. Happy Halloween, everybody, by the way. As I was dropping off my toddler this morning at 3K, he was dressed as a pirate and he reached into his pocket and pulled out an extra eye patch and said, Mama, you need this for your work today. Chuckling to myself, imagining showing up on this Teams meeting with an eye patch. Oh boy. All right. Well, I want to tell you about this journey. So really have focused my entire career on public policy, out of the sense that it is really the decisions that we make together as a people through our elected officials in government that ultimately shape our individual outcomes. That opportunity and mobility and prosperity is built on a foundation, a structural foundation that makes it easier for some people to get ahead and harder for others. That makes some paths wide open to us while it closes windows and even sometimes doors. And so when you really understand the structures that guide opportunity, the whole world makes a lot more sense. And that's an awareness that I gained pretty early on because I was fortunate. I was a curious kid. I was the kind of kid who was always asking why. And my whys, when I look back on it now, were really the whys about inequality in the sort of as the inequality era, which is we've been 50 years into now, was really taking hold. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. And in the 1980s, when I was coming up, you really began to see the impacts of the massive policy shifts that were happening in our broader economy to decide to ratchet down manufacturing and look for a lower, cost of labor in the South in many instances, and then further south overseas. It was reflected in the cuts to public services and to government. And it just so happened that those two sectors, public sector work and manufacturing, were the sectors that had helped to build a hard-fought Black middle class on the south side of Chicago. And so you really began to see, when I was a child, the signs of that falling apart. And so I asked why. Why did the plant on Kedzie close? Why does my classmate Ralph's, why are his belongings out on the curb, right? What is going on in my neighborhood, in my community? And I was fortunate because my mother was someone who had started work in healing in holistic healthcare with mostly young mothers, single mothers in the Robert Taylor public housing projects, and then had realized that it's difficult to heal an unwell physical body that's living in an unwell social body. And that, in fact, so many of the problems that were ending up in stress and chaos for these young, fragile families were really about upstream decisions. And so she always pointed me to look upstream, look to the structural causes and the bigger decisions that we make together. That's why I've always been interested in public policy, in seeing how, for example, we are having this conversation at a moment when the US poverty rate is the lowest it has been on record. Now, that is not to say that there is not a lot of struggle and want still in this great nation. But we as a nation made a series of policy choices during this pandemic to fix our unemployment insurance so that gig workers could be eligible, to fix our SNAP formula, to create stimulus payments and the child tax credit, all of which have come together, eviction moratoriums and foreclosure moratoriums have come together to create a more solid floor. And what that means to me is it's a reminder that poverty is a policy choice. It's always been a policy choice. And we can decide to continue to make that choice to ensure that particularly rural Americans and young Americans and children who've been the most aided by these anti-poverty measures never again have to experience that level of suffering and want. So that's why public policy. And I was lucky enough to have get an entry-level job at a startup public policy research and advocacy organization, fresh out of undergraduate, and really grow up with the organization, to go to law school, then come back, and to become the first woman, youngest person by about a half, and the first person of color to lead the organization after two older white male presidents. And I really want to, acknowledge the mentorship that happened in order to put me in a position to and encourage me 5 different times to put my hat in the ring to become the leader of the organization when I was just 33 years old. Because this is something that matters, of course, to you all as professionals in diversity and inclusion, I should note that when I became the president of DEMOS, of that public policy organization, I was the only person of color on the executive team, on the 6-person executive team, and the organization was 75% white. And I had nonetheless, really, as I said, grown up with the organization. So I truly did experience, sort of a double consciousness of feeling very close to and enmeshed in the culture of the organization, but also knowing that it needed to transform. Not just because it had a Black woman leader now, but because our lack of diversity and our lack of staff-wide understanding about the role of race in the work that we did was lessening our impact. And so I set out to design a multi-year racial equity organizational transformation process for my little organization. It was ambitious, as only a new young leader who doesn't know any better can take on, who decided, let us change everything, let us transform everything, from the issues we work on, to the partners that we collaborate with, to how we communicate to funders, to our media work, to all of our back-end administration work, all of our finances, our HR, how we recruit, how we train, how we promote, all of that with a racial equity lens. And it wasn't easy and it wasn't always perfect, but in the end, after 4 years, the organization had doubled in size in terms of revenue. We had become a 60% person of color organization from 75% white. And we'd done that mainly through growth. And we had, more importantly, I think the piece that really gives me the most pride looking back on it now is that the 75%, white staff, most of them stayed, and they were deeply grateful for the investments in their own education. They felt like so much of what we began to learn to really understand the role of racism in inequality and in the work they were doing was a gift. That was the word we heard over and over again, that people felt like they'd been robbed of their shared history. They felt embarrassed and sometimes outraged of how little they knew about the history of their community and their country, and even the issues that they considered themselves expert on. Once they took off the blinders and were able to see the role of race and racism, they felt empowered, they felt smarter, they felt like they could make more strategic decisions. So nonetheless, I am not talking to you as the president of DEMOS. So something happened. And I decided in 2017 to leave what in many ways was my dream job, and to go across the country multiple times, from California to Mississippi to Maine and back again, to try to answer a question that became the heart of my book, The Sum of Us. I should note, and a little bit of Georgia pride, that the current president of DEMOS is none other than Taifa Smith Butler, who for many years was the president of the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, and is a wonderful policy expert who is now leading DEMOS and its focus on racial equity and addressing inequality in our economy and our democracy. So just a quick shout out to the GBPI and to Taifa Smith Butler. So this journey that I took was really, for me, about trying to answer a simple question. And that's the question, why can't we have nice things in America? And by nice things, I don't mean hovercraft backpacks or laundry that does itself, both of which would be great and fun. No, I mean things like wages that can keep workers out of poverty, reliable modern infrastructure in the country whose infrastructure used to be the envy of the world. I mean nice things like universal child care and paid family leave and a well-funded public school in every neighborhood. These are the kinds of things that our country should be able to afford, that countries with a lot less wealth than ours have been able to deliver for their citizens, and yet somehow we still fall short. And when I think about the we who can't seem to have nice things, I mean both the we, that is the white Americans who are the largest group of the uninsured and the impoverished, as well as the Americans of color who are disproportionately so. And in trying to answer that question, I came across three core insights in my journey. The first is that our progress to a large degree is being held back by a story. And that's a zero-sum story. It's a story that many people in the US tell themselves about how we relate to one another. It's the idea that we're trapped in a zero-sum game, that there's a fixed pie of well-being. And so if I get a bigger slice, somebody else must get a smaller one. It's the idea that is actually quite racialized in the US, according to the data. It's a sense that there are racial and ethnic groups that are competing for status, belonging, and hierarchy. And it's racialized, interestingly, because white Americans are more likely to see the world through this zero-sum prism, more likely to be convinced that progress for people of color has to come at white folks' expense. I think it's interesting that folks of color don't tend to believe that our progress has to come at white folks' expense. Now, I want to remind everyone that the zero sum economically is an untrue story, right? That in fact, in any economic game, you don't want to be rooting against anybody, right? You want all your players on the field scoring points. You don't want anybody sidelined due to debt, discrimination, and disadvantage. That's how you score more points, all the players on the field. And in fact, the racial economic divide is costing this country's economy, and it has been for a long time. Citigroup calculated that over the last 20 years, our overall US GDP, our gross domestic product, the biggest measure of our economy, has lost $16 trillion due to the black-white divides in things like income, education, wealth, and business investment. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco calculated just last year that if you add a gender lens onto that and you calculate the overall cost to our economy of the gap between white men and everyone else, that's $2.6 trillion just in 1 year that we could have had a bigger economy by, that we lost that potential. And so when I think about the zero sum, I think about the ways in which we have a story that suggests that we don't want all of our players on the team scoring points because we don't believe ultimately that we are on the same team. Now, when you think about that zero sum mentality and you put it in a real world context, that gives you a story like the story of what happened to many of the nearly 2,000 lavishly funded grand resort style pools that used to be a feature of the American landscape. Now, these were public swimming pools. They were part of a building boom of public amenities in the 1930s and 40s that include roads and bridges, parks, libraries, and schools. It was part of the New Deal ethos of public goods that said, you know what, we had the Gilded Age, the first one. We learned our lessons. We had the Great Depression. We learned our lesson. And so now we understand that government has a right and a responsibility to ensure a decent standard of living for our people, and that's going to be our winning economic formula. So this ethos of public goods was reflected in things that were arguably more economically significant than public swimming pools, things like Social Security for the elderly, things like a massive investment in housing that workers could afford. And on top of that, something heretofore unimagined, the idea that working class people could have a government-backed financial instrument called a mortgage that would allow them to pay off a house over time and be able to have an asset that would appreciate and that they could pass on to their children. The GI Bill, another public good. Altogether, these kinds of public goods did work. They created the greatest middle class the world has ever seen, the highest standard of living in the world. In short, the American dream. But, my friends, to a degree that even I was not fully aware of before I started the research for my book, The Sum of Us, those public goods that I just described weren't truly for all of the public. All of them were racially exclusionary in one way or another, whether it was explicitly, as in the housing market, where the New Deal federal government, at the same time as it poured hundreds of billions of dollars into housing, affordable housing for workers and home ownership, it also drew maps of the entire country and created a grading system to say to lenders and private developers, you may not build and lend in these areas because they are Negro areas. That carved out of the promise of affordable home ownership virtually the entire Black community of the United States for generations. That has led directly to today's racial wealth divide, the fact that the average Black family has about 13 cents on the dollar in wealth of what the average white family has. And specifically, this is so much a story of history showing up in your wallet that the average Black college graduate has less wealth than the average white high school dropout. That's about compounding interest being paid or being earned on explicitly racist decisions made in the 20th century. So the public goods of home ownership and affordable housing was exclusionary. So was Social Security, which was for the elderly, and yet it carved out the two job categories in a compromise with the Southern Caucus of the Congress at the time, the two job categories that most Black workers were in, agriculture and domestic work in it. And then finally, the GI Bill was race neutral on its face, but those benefits were filtered through often racially segregated education and housing sectors. And so altogether, this social contract of public goods was only for a public whom white Americans believed to be good, not for the ones that they'd been taught to disdain and distrust. But once in the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement began to empower Black families who were saying, you know what, those are our tax dollars too that have been funding those public goods all along. And in the case of the swimming pools, we want our kids to swim too. Towns and cities across the country, and not just in the Jim Crow South, faced a decision. Would they integrate the pools? Would they allow public goods to be truly for everyone? Many decided no. That out of this zero-sum mentality, they'd rather destroy a public good than share it. So many towns across the country drained the water out of their public pools, filled them in with dirt, buried them over. In Montgomery, Alabama, where I traveled for the book, there's a huge, beautiful Central Park, but in the middle there used to be 1,000+ person swimming pool, one of the biggest in the region. And effective January 1st, 1959, it closed. And they closed the entire Parks and Recreation system and closed it for a decade. Now, why is this story both a story and a bit of a parable about the drained pool significant to someone who studies economic policy? It's significant because it shows more than anything else that I learned in nearly 20 years of studying economic history, studying the public policy choices that led to record inequality today. Not just the how of the shift from an era where we really built the American dream to the inequality era, but the why. Why would this country have turned its back on the formula that created such broad middle-class security? Why would we turn our backs on the formula, for example, in higher education, that created the land-grant colleges, that had the cost of college be picked up by the government in a combination of robust state funding and government grants, back when the college-going population was over 90% white? In so many states across the country, you see a story of drained pool politics, draining the coffers for state investment in the wonderful state college systems. That has shifted the burden of the cost of college onto families. And might I add, right at the moment when we made other changes in our public policy to ensure that a college degree was necessary for a middle class life, most states decided to price that college degree out of reach for the working class who were trying to get into the middle class. It makes no sense. It's a sense of self-sabotage that is explained by understanding the role between racial resentment, between these old stories of zero-sum racial hierarchy and competition, and the sense that government had gone from being the enforcer of the racial hierarchy to the upender of the racial hierarchy. An anti-government system sentiment that really an anti-government sentiment that really began to track with racial resentment. The sense that people of color were somehow taking something away from white people. That sense, sociologists have determined, is correlated with a very strong anti-government sentiment. So much so that it ends up often creating drained pool politics in which white, black, brown, all families suffer. Because the core idea of the sum of us is that racism in our politics and our policymaking ultimately has a cost for everyone. Now, you can read the book yourself and see all the different other examples that I found in our public policy, this core dysfunction. Whenever you're scratching your head and saying, why does it seem like we can't fix this problem? Why does it seem like this big collective action problem that needs a big solution, that is a common problem for millions of people, and there must be common solutions when we have been unable to come together? It's often because that coming together would require bridging across lines of race and require believing in the vehicles for collective action that would make people swim in the same pool. Now, nonetheless, fortunately, I also discovered in my journey plenty of signs of communities rejecting the zero-sum lie, being willing to link arms across lines of race, and thereby unlock those solidarity dividends, those gains that we can only achieve when we come together. You know, I think about how important collective action is. You know, I can recycle all I want. I can't stop global climate change on my own. You know, I can tutor my son. I can't make sure that his neighborhood school is well funded on my own. Increasingly, the challenges that we face are not ones that we can solve on our own. They're ones in which there are common solutions. And those common solutions, if we can get together and create a coalition of the many across lines of race and origin, are solidarity dividends. I told stories in the book of solidarity dividends in some of the most unlikely places. In Maine, the whitest state in the nation, where a new community of mostly African Muslim refugees and immigrants have been able to revitalize a dying deindustrialized town. Or in Richmond, California, a highly polluted place where there are 350 toxic sites. And it was only when all of the different segregated neighborhoods had leaders come together and put aside their mistrust and differences, they were able to build enough power to clean up some of the worst pollution and to create new green jobs for their youth. These stories of solidarity dividends are ones that I think provide a template on an institutional level, on a community level, and of course on a national and global level. It's one that I think particularly resonates with our youth in America who are already living in the nation that we're becoming. They're already living in a generation with no racial majority that is more reflective of our global population. You know, if we give them the tools they need to succeed, if we give them the interactions with one another on college campuses and in community life to be able to unlock the solidarity dividends of diversity, I do believe that the sky is the limit. In the final chapter of the book, I just touch very briefly on the economic benefits of diversity, the ways in which coming together with people who have been shaped by their life circumstances to see the world slightly differently creates a kind of productive friction that makes diversity our superpower. More diverse teams have more creative problem solving. They're more innovative. They create more empathy. These are the kinds of skills that we are going to need to tackle complex problems in our changing world. And so that's why I just want to salute you, all of you who are professionals, who are dedicated to that vision of unlocking the superpower that is diversity and making sure that it's not just about numbers, but it's also about optimizing the human capacity and potential, removing the barriers to true inclusion and flourishing for all of our youth and our people. Thank you. Well, now I'm really excited to take questions. Hi.
Okay. Thank you, Heather, for that inspiring and informative talk, and for being our guest speaker at this 11th Annual Diversity Summit, sponsored by the University System of Georgia. I want to say to you that as someone who has experienced the impact of zero-sum policies personally, I certainly want to thank you for that metaphor. I grew up in a small town in Mississippi where they, in the mid-60s, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, they did in fact fill the swimming pool in my hometown. And my father was also discriminated against with the GI Bill. So these things have a very personal meaning for me. So I deeply enjoyed the book. And I know that while many of us, certainly beyond me, know the unfortunate outcome of zero-sum policies, we don't always understand the history, the historical context, and the personal context that accompany these policies. So on behalf of the many readers of The Sum of Us, and certainly the listeners here today on this call, I want to thank you again for your research, for your analysis, and for your hopeful vision for the future.
Thank you.
What we'd like to do now is have a brief conversation. I'd like to have a brief conversation with you so that we can talk about some specific questions that will help our audience fully understand, or more fully understand, the implications of your research as members of institutions of higher education and as citizens of the state of Georgia. So the first question I want you to share, and I really do appreciate the metaphors that you have used in this book that help us focus on the kinds of things, our superpower, on the zero-sum policies, all of these things that we really need to take with us into other areas of our work. But would you share with us the ways in which you think institutions of higher education have participated in zero-sum policies, maybe still participating? You did talk about the land grant policies, and what you think has been the impact of institutions of higher education participating in these policies?
Yeah. Well, that's a rich and loaded question, and I could definitely, spend a day-long seminar in a full dialogue with all of you, because I'm sure many of you have your own ideas and examples as well of where you've seen that kind of thinking. But I'll just say one thing that has always struck me when we talk about diversity in higher education, when we talk about admissions and scholarships, and all the ways in which students are really pitted against one another, and there's this message that governments often communicate to our young people that's not just about achievement, but that ultimately suggests that college is itself the prize. Right, is itself the reward for a life well, lived when these young people are 17 years old. And I think that we need to be reminded that it's not a dog-eat-dog competition, that ultimately what happens in the years of college instruction is hopefully that young people, no matter what their circumstance, and particularly if their circumstance has led them to, economic stress, to underfunded schools, to overcrowded classrooms, that it's the instruction that happens on a college campus that should make up for some of those underinvestments in our youth. That should be a time of great learning, and not just a time where young people learn, the hyper-competitive sort of rewards when they're still so young. And so I think about that in terms of just an overall approach, that I think a lot of the sort of inequality in our economy has sort of bled down into the way we think about and talk about college, as if we're rewarding children for all of this work, as opposed to still believing in the human capacity of each young mind and being willing to let teachers do the work of teaching. We should see young people really growing on campus and in their college years, no matter what their circumstances. Obviously Georgia has a very unique financing system, with the Hope and Zell Miller scholarships, right? With a still really unmatched, commitment to college affordability based on academic achievement. And so, I'm optimistic and encouraged by the ways in which college has remained affordable to many of the most academically prepared students, 2 million since the program was created. But I also think that it's important, particularly for the diversity imperative of Georgia schools, to be focused on the ways in which financial pressures still do often lead to people losing their scholarships, to having to choose between buying a textbook and keeping the lights on, to having to choose between sending money back home because the healthcare costs are too high for an ailing parent or relative, and being able to put gas in the car to get to class on time. And it really is those kinds of trade-offs that makes the system still not as equitable as it should be. And so I just, I do think about the ways in which inequality is replicated, and that what we think of as sort of a meritocracy of grades is so often influenced by something deeply unfair, which is economic advantage or disadvantage.
Thank you. And I think that us are beginning to think about how we reach out to those students, particularly in the context of this larger solidarity dividend that we could realize if we did that. I think it's really helpful and important for us to think about. You state in your book that the time has come, and I think you are indicating that and implicating that in this first answer, that the time has come for to move away from zero-sum thinking. That precisely because of the current demographic and economic changes in our society, we've now reached what you call the productive and moral limit of zero-sum economic policies, and that we have no choice now but to start aiming for the solidarity dividend. So given this imperative, what do you think, or what do you believe educational institutions and citizens in small and large communities throughout the state can begin to do to help us cognitively shift from zero-sum thinking, and in more practical ways? How can we begin to instill a solidarity, a dividend paradigm in place of the zero-sum paradigm?
Well, I think one of the first steps that's really necessary to understand the ways in which the zero sum has been lying to us, or people who have been selling the zero sum story, often for their own profit, have been lying to us, is to debunk many of the stereotypes that hold the kind of zero sum racial hierarchy in place, right? And one of the ways to do that is to learn your history. So for example, when I give the often, for many people, jaw-dropping fact about the Black college graduate on average having less wealth, that's home equity, savings, stocks and bonds, liquid savings and assets, less wealth than the average white high school dropout, that challenges our stereotypes. Where we see racial economic inequality across our landscape, we see poorer Black neighborhoods and wealthier white neighborhoods, and we think, well, there's something about hard work or effort or even jobs and education that is explaining those disparities. And yet, if you know a little bit of your own history, and I say own history because it's all of our histories, right? The histories of the ways in which explicitly racist decisions help shape economic opportunity, where and how we can live, how our schools are funded, what businesses are invested in versus raised to make a way for a highway, for example. If you know enough of that history of your own community, and you never have to look very far, then that truth can begin to chip away at the stereotypes, and we can reclaim the idea that ultimately, Black, white, or brown, we all want the same things. We all want to be secure, to have enough to meet our basic needs, and a shot at fulfilling our dreams. We want to be understood and respected. We want to create bonds with people. We want to have families that we love and that are protected. We want to breathe clean air and drink clean water. We want to feel like we have a say over the decisions that impact our lives. And it's not a zero sum. If one of my neighbors has all of those things, that doesn't mean that I don't have a shot at having all of those things. And in fact, our economy has been distorted by that zero-sum thinking. And so I do think that learning history in order to refute stereotypes, in order to understand why the economic disparities we see today exist, is a really important part of the how of getting beyond the zero-sum thinking. I was looking at a report, a really wonderful report by the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute in preparation for today, that was looking at the inequalities in the tax system in Georgia, and how, in fact, higher income Georgians pay less in taxes than do working class Georgians. And, when you think about the ways in which we sort of attribute virtue and hard work to people who are doing well successfully, which may be true, but we also often blame people who are struggling for not being able to dig out of poverty. And something we know, that we have always known, is that the poor pay more. It is more expensive to have a car that doesn't work well. It is more expensive to live farther away from your job. It is more expensive to get fees tacked onto your checking account for overdrawing when the bills come due. It is more expensive to have to go and use substandard services, and often more expensive predatory services. All of these ways in which there's a tax, sales and use and taxes, also time taxes on people who need more than ever to have a clear path out of poverty, are things that we need to think about when when we are beginning to sort of buy into some of the zero-sum, often, victim blaming and over attributing a meritocracy to the current distribution of wealth and opportunity.
Yes, thank you. I think the imparting the history is really important, and one of the things I think that we're doing in many communities and many diversity offices is really trying to put forth those programs that provide that history so that we understand, and certainly today's program is one of those. Because this is an imperative, and you say that that time has come now for us to understand that we're all in this together, that we can all prosper together. And I think about the enrollment statistics, and I think about the demographics, particularly the demographics in the state of Georgia. And the question I want to ask you is, what do we stand to lose if we don't engage in exercising, promoting the solidarity dividend? What do we stand to lose now in 2021 if we don't begin to do this work?
Carolyn, that's such a good question. I appreciate it. The system has already identified in the the college completion program that higher educational attainment, that achieving the degrees and certifications that are necessary for middle-class jobs is an imperative to the entire state. And I think that is a very wise articulation of the way in which the future middle class of Georgia relies on the very similar kinds of investments that created the broad American middle class. And those are public goods. Those are public investments that then become the springboard for private innovation. And that when we shortchange public goods and public investments from our early childhood through to higher education, from infrastructure funding to make sure that all students have access to broadband at home and they can drink clean water and have mass transit, for example, to be able to get to school and to work. Those are the kinds of investments that ensure a broad future middle class. And that ultimately, when you look at the demographic changes that are happening in the US, it creates even more of an imperative to uproot the systemic and structural inequalities that have plagued their parents and grandparents. I think we can all say and agree, left, right, and center, that we believe in fairness in the United States. And we don't want to be a society of economic or racial apartheid. And so I think the real question is, are we willing to look closely at the places and the instances where racism has held the pen as we've written our laws in society? Are we willing to do the statistical analysis to understand why it is that the poor pay more, and why it is that communities of color are living in a drain pool situation, but so are often rural white folks who are working class and are struggling to make ends meet, and who are only able to avail themselves of poorly funded services and infrastructure. So I think looking at the ways in which the current status quo is costing us dearly, is costing us from cradle to grave, is costing us in terms of healthcare costs, is costing us in terms of jobs and dreams unfulfilled. I think it's clear what the imperative then becomes for investing in what is going to be the future middle class of Georgia. And hopefully it looks a lot more like the population of Georgia than the middle class does today.
Thank you. In your book, you gave some really compelling examples of communities that were in fact engaged in realizing the solidarity dividend in their own communities. And I'm just wondering whether there are any examples of institutions of higher education that are doing that. I mean, I know that you can, this is another one that you can probably talk about for a long time. And what we're trying to do often is to find ways to make that shift, to engage our students and our larger college communities and the communities around the state in programs and educational opportunities that help them buy into the solidarity dividend. So are there any examples, and if there are none that you know right off, that's okay, we can go to the next question, but I was just wondering whether there is any model out there that you have found particularly appealing.
Yeah. Well, you know, it is interesting if we think about the solidarity dividend of college completion within the campus, right? So that's absolutely a solidarity dividend when we can put aside the zero-sum thinking and invest in making sure that resources are being equitably distributed so that students who are struggling, because remember, the number one reason for now 20 plus years, the data has been consistent for students dropping out and not finishing college is financial pressures and financial stress, right? So if we can begin to find ways for those financial pressures to be alleviated for the students who need it the most, then we actually can find and unlock that solidarity dividend. So here I am thinking about reforms that have been in place in just one or two of the schools in the system. For example, I'm thinking about Georgia State University's Keep Hope Alive program that's providing $500 a semester in academic coaching and advising. Students at Georgia State are less likely to lose their scholarships and more likely to regain them. So that's just one very small example, not to pick favorites among all the wonderful educators and institutions here, but it is something that stuck out to me as I was looking at that very important question of college completion and the financial supports and just support and help in the moments of financial crisis often become determinative. More broadly, I think that opening up the doors of the colleges to the community through mentorship, through making sure that public programming is truly public and that community members beyond the towers and the gates can have access to them, to partnering with businesses. For example, you know, today, breaking news that 1 out of every 3 cybersecurity jobs in the country is unfilled, and Microsoft plans to try to hire 250,000 more cybersecurity workers in the next few years. Those kinds of partnerships that understand that there's a benefit to education and benefit to the local community and to our communities, in this instance, our national security, to having a kind of a win-win model.
Right. Thank you so much. Those are some really good ways for us to begin, and shout out to Georgia State for what they are doing, and now in your repertoire of good examples. We all appreciate that. This was my last question, and because more than half of the book outlines the negative impacts of those zero-sum policies, but you have a good share of the book where you talk about the hopefulness that's out there, you know, the solidarity dividend, that it can happen, and you give some really inspiring examples of that happening. So the question I have for you is, why are you optimistic? Tell us why we should believe that we can achieve with what we know in the current realities. Why that we can believe that people won't put dirt in the swimming pool?
Yeah. So I think I'm optimistic for a few reasons. Some, purely kind of data driven. Right? We are all living in the bottom of the drain pool now, right? We are in a society right now where 1% of the population owns more wealth than the entire middle class, while 40% of adult workers before the pandemic were paid too little to meet their basic needs for things like health care, housing, and food. The economic stress that most working and middle class families are facing is creating a sense of shared struggle and common bond. That means that we all have a stake in refilling the pool of public goods. And, as I think about all the parts of the agenda that's being debated in Washington right now, the Build Back Better agenda, it's kind of the list of those nice things that I said that seems to be elusive. And that's why it's, popular with a bipartisan majority of voters, And so this is the kind of thing that actually unites families across lines of race. Do we have pre-K and childcare expenses capped at 7% of our income? Hey, everybody can get on board with that. Employers can get on board with that because they have realized that, as the kids are running past the Zoom and as, service workers are not able to get back to work because there's nobody to safely watch their children, that care is the kind of work that makes all other work possible. So those kinds of things are solidarity dividends. And so the ways in which most Americans are understanding that we've tried it all on our own as much as possible, it's just not adding up. And actually maybe we need some common solutions to these common problems. That makes me hopeful. What also makes me hopeful, not on a sort of, kind of evidence-based and evidence basis, but really almost a spiritual basis, is my understanding as the descendant of enslaved people on both sides of my family, that we've always had hope. We've always had to have hope. That my ancestors faced so much more and had so much less with which to face it. And they didn't despair. And because they didn't despair, we are here. That makes despair simply unavailable to me. I simply can't access it. It's too far out of reach for me. If I ever try to reach for despair, my great-grandmother Flossie Mcgee, who lived to be 105 years old, would come down and smack my hand out. She used to say, you draw back a nub, reach for that. So I do believe there's something that we need to tap into, and it's not just for African Americans. So many people are here and where they are because of the hard work of their ancestors, and so we really do need to remember that it is not worse than it has ever been. There's more internet than there's ever been. There's more pollution in the air, more carbon pollution, greenhouse gases in the air. But other than that, we still got hope.
Yes. Well, that's a beautiful answer to that question. And I'm sure many of us are inspired by that. We have a large audience, Heather, who is waiting to have their questions answered. And I'm going to shift now to Dr. Michelle Garfield Cook, who is the Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Georgia. And I will send it over now to you, Dr. Cook.
Thank you so much, Dr. Denard. And thank you so much, Heather, for your engagement in this conversation. It has really been incredibly fruitful. But as was mentioned, we do have several people watching who have some questions. So with the assistance of my colleague at Kennesaw State University, Dr. Sonia Tosin, we're going to try to present some of those questions. So the first question is, and I will be quoting directly, I love the imagery of the community with which you illustrate the power of diversity. Do you have an example of that where the majority of the diversity is not an immigrant community? I believe that immigrants may be closer to the possibility of that kind of community, whereas those who've had generations of pain may not be, because of the understandable healing that needs to happen.
So this is really real. I'm just going to be very frank in the response to that very insightful question. It was harder for me to find examples of solidarity dividends, of cross-racial organizing, cross-racial solidarity in Black-white communities than it was for me to find them in places where there was a lot of, newcomers. And I think, for a lot of the reasons that the questioner named, the wounds are older. Anti-Blackness specifically is its own particular American poison. And yeah, that said, I'm right now back on the road, which has been very interesting. I've been taking a number of trips to really focus in on storytelling about the solidarity dividend. The book, The Sum of Us, includes, as my editor said, you tried to swallow the ocean. I'm going all over talking about so many topics, but I have an opportunity right now to do a podcast, an audio series that is specifically just focused on telling stories of cross-racial solidarity and telling stories of community, some from the book and others that are new that I've discovered since then. And there I have really focused on trying to find out if it's possible and what does it take to really create that kind of community healing and the kind of solidarity that's really necessary, even in some of the toughest places. So one of the stories that we are going to tell is the story of the defeat of a pipeline in Memphis, Tennessee. That was absolutely a story of cross-racial solidarity and people coming together and fighting, a powerful, interest that was really threatening, the clean water of the mostly Black community in this part of Memphis. And it was really about Black organizing in solidarity with, white folks and Indigenous folks from the community. And so the Fight for 15 story in various parts of the country is very much a story of Black workers in the service and retail sectors, fast food, really standing up against the kind of, wages that ensure that people are kept in poverty. And there really are ways in which history rhymes with today's very low federal minimum wage. I know that in Georgia it has the distinction of being even lower at just $5.25. And I always think when folks start out at being paid $0 to get to $5.25 by 200 years later is not enough progress.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that response. Another question that came in is, how would you help people unlearn the zero-sum game when those individuals are holding on to confirmation bias?
Well, I'll acknowledge it's gotten tougher, right? It is, since I finished the book, I finished the book about 9 months into the pandemic, 6 months into the pandemic, and the way in which shelter in place and being at home has put people even further into the internet wormholes, the ways in which, as we are learning, it seems like more blockbuster reporting and whistleblowing day after day, just how much it's not just us, we're not imagining it, the internet is making us angrier. That in terms of, monetary value, that saying, a click that is an angry emoji, right? That an angry reaction is 5 times more profitable for Facebook than a like. That we are really being sold hate for profit. And that the degree of disinformation and misinformation has made it much harder for us to see one another and us to not believe that, the worst about our neighbors. So that's real. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. At the same time, the fundamental power of relationships has not disappeared. And one thing that I would say is it's been difficult, as people have sort of gone into their corners, to keep dialogue with people who see the world slightly differently. And I would encourage us all to have the courage of our own convictions and the trust in humanity that we would like to see, in the world, to reach out and to try, once a month to talk to somebody who doesn't agree completely with you about the way they see the world, and to do so from a place of listening and compassion. And I personally find it's easier for me to have the grace that is necessary to actually communicate and listen deeply if I remember how much folks are being sold zero-sum ideas for the, at profit to somebody else, right? And ultimately, the person I'm talking to is buying something, right? They're not manufacturing it, they're selling it, they're buying it, and that makes me feel a little more grace towards, folks who may see the world differently than I do.
Thank you, and thank you for that very specific thing we can do. And I think that focus on grace is so needed in society right now. The next question is, how can we move beyond checking off the diversity box in higher ed job searches to truly bring equality and diversity to administrative and teaching structures in the academy?
Mm-hmm. So, the first step that I took at Demos in that racial equity transformation process that I referenced was before I made any changes, before I even did the assessment, right? The audit. Okay, where are we? Not just in the numbers, but what do people think about the culture? Who's here? Who left? What is the experience? What are the change points that we need to identify in order to set goals? Before I did any of that, I remember very vividly, I think I was on a train maybe going to DC, and I just sat and I wrote down why it mattered to Demos. Not because we're good people, not because of another unarmed man being murdered by the police, not because of anything else, but because of the mission that already brought everybody to the organization. Why is diversity, equity, inclusion mission critical? And once I articulated that in fact we could not, as an organization that was trying to combat inequality, achieve our mission if we didn't have a staff that was as diverse as the people that we were looking to serve, if we didn't have equitable structures to be able to get the most out of that diverse staff and to experience what it's like to address inequality even within your own institution. That if we didn't have staff of all backgrounds with the fluency, the competency, the skills to identify racist structures, to lead and collaborate across lines of race, to create diverse coalitions, if we didn't do that, we were not going to succeed in our mission. And I think so often when you skip that first step and you don't really do the work, and so I wrote that, shared with my executive team, and then we had each team, finance team, the legal team, the research team, do their own versions of what is the racial equity rationale for this team. And they debated it and they wrestled with it and they had drafts. And then they came up with language and, it was all over the office. And we spent that time so that we really felt that it was as important as the other things we were doing. And it wasn't just checking a box where we're kind of like, I don't really know why we're doing it. We kind of do it because we're supposed to do it. I don't necessarily think it'll be better if we do it, right? We really dealt with those challenges first and foremost. And I think that helped. And I would say that's one of the pieces, right? Can you really articulate why it's so important to have, an administration that looks like this my screen right now, when the student body looks like it is, when the state of Georgia looks like it is? Why is that important pedagogically? Why is that important in terms of the future of the institution? If you can articulate that, and if leaders can over communicate it. Any kind of change you want to make as a leader, you need to communicate it 10 times more than you think. Then I think it will move beyond checking the boxes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. That is great. The next question. In many large public university systems, like the University System of Georgia, much of the emphasis or many of the resources are put into the large flagship institutions that have competitive admissions. And while smaller regional institutions that serve huge numbers of students from underserved, lower socioeconomic groups, and have high numbers of first-generation undocumented students, receive significantly fewer financial and personnel resources. How can we help those students to succeed when power and privilege is literally built into the structure of public university systems?
Yeah. So I think this is a really great question. I'm sure it's not the first time you all have considered this and talked about this. I think this is an instance where it's really important to challenge the zero-sum thinking that says that we need to have this hierarchy and that we need to concentrate the resources, and that it is not in the interest of the flagship to have more thriving, regional and smaller schools, right? So if you take that model, I think it's really important to, develop a case that says, why it's important for the flourishing, not just of the regional schools, but of the entire system, to make sure that we are creating student success for the students who need it the most. And that education itself, higher education itself, becomes a transformative experience for people all over the state, and not just this prize up on a, city on the hill of the most elite. Why is that in the interest of the entire system? Are we, talking about the fact that the faculty of the flagship could be coming from today's young people? Are we talking about the fact that honestly, this is purely not political in terms of partisanship, but in terms of, just what drives politics in systems, as education becomes more and more unaffordable and elite and competitive, you get the large population saying, well, why should we support that at all? If that's just for the very tip top, and it's not for my kids, and it's not benefiting my rural community, why should we support that with our tax dollars? And so I think we do need to make a systems argument for why equity is good for the whole system. And that equity does include equity in terms of the resources within the system.
Great. Thank you so very much. I believe, Dr. Williams, that we are at time.
We are, unless Ms. Mcgee is going to grant us more time. I'm sure everybody has another question they'd like to ask her, but we are at the time.
Well, I appreciate this so much. I would be happy to go on, but I also acknowledge that oftentimes people have Zooms backed up. So it's not just my time. You all are very busy too. I really have, enjoyed this conversation, have really enjoyed the thoughtful audience questions, some of the best I've ever had, in fact, as well as the dialogue with you all. It's really just been a treat and has warmed my heart this Friday morning. And I want to thank you all for inviting me to be a part of this 11th annual, if I'm not mistaken, summit. For the many of you who have read the book and who have, incorporated the ideas and debated them in community, one of my big visions, my big dream when I set out to author this book was to have people in groups and in communities read it together and debate it and find some way to have a kind of shared story about the harms of racism to us all, as a way to get on the same page so that we can begin to turn the page and rewrite the story of America for a stronger, more prosperous future for everyone. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
All right.
And on that note, I certainly have the privilege and honor of closing out our 11th annual summit today. I certainly want to start by saying thank you so much. We receive and return your gratitude. Ms. Mcgee, Dr. Mcgee, it's been a pleasure to hear you speak. It's been a pleasure to have the level of engagement. As we close out, and I promise to be brief, I know I sit either between another meeting or lunch, I want to remind everyone and warmly invite you to the aforementioned opportunity to continue this conversation, to spend some time with the Georgia Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. Remember, on Monday, there is an event you're going to receive, if you haven't already, some information about that. Again, it is a virtual lunch and learn, and we invite you to join us for that particular session. We believe you'll find it engaging and certainly a fruitful way to spend your time. And with that, I certainly want to thank the USG for their longstanding support of this particular summit. I absolutely want to thank my fellow Chief Diversity Officers around the system, as well as all of the diversity professionals and our guest here today. We thank you for spending this very valuable time with us, for giving us your attention and your engagement. And with that, I certainly will again warmly thank our speaker today and give her some very silent applause. Thank you so much. We've enjoyed this time. It certainly has been our honor. And with that, Felita, if there is nothing further, I believe we will give folks their afternoon.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We will do our best to get a recording of this out so everyone can hear it, those that had trouble checking in. But thank you, and thank you to the CDO officers for your assistance. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.